Hey everybody, this is Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our top tier review series with the nation of Israel. And of course, here's a quick reminder of the grading scale, with S being best in category, A being very good, B being average, C being poor, and F being nothing suitable. And of course, we will be going from the most important vehicles to the least important vehicles in descending order. That being said, people who have played Israel top tier are probably well aware that there's at least one F grade coming in this review. And kicking things off as we always do, the most important vehicles for any lineup, the main battle tanks or MBTs. Israel has a fairly straightforward MBT lineup consisting of three separate Merkava 4s, the Merkava 4B, the Merkava 4 LIC, and the Merkava 4M, so easy enough there. The pros of these three vehicles are that they have a good damage model, they have a rather ridiculous high explosive shell, a fast reload, and they are ambidirectional. The biggest cons of these vehicles is that their armor is fairly inconsistent. And of course, expanding on those points, the damage model of the Merkava 4s in general features a lot of internal compartmentalization. It also features a lot of internal bulkheads. It also puts the ammo out of the way of most shots, with them being in the back left and back right storage bins. And of course, the first stage ammo is actually in a protected bustle in the back of the turret. This, combined with the vehicle's relatively large size and forward mounted engine, does allow the Merkava 4s to absorb hits relatively well, although not always in the best condition to return fire. Now, the advantage of a ridiculous high explosive shell deserves a pretty big asterisk. I go into pretty good detail with how the shell works in the ROM Siegel guide. In fact, I have a series of videos looking at basically all of the Merkavas, so if you want more in-depth on just the main battle tanks, those are available on my channel. And to put it in simpler terms, it's a timed high explosive shell that's also a semi-armor piercing shell, and for some reason this combination of traits allows it to hit the road wheel of a main battle tank and completely destroy it, regardless of what tank it is. As an example, in the fight in the background, you can see me with an M1 Abrams, and I can't see the front of the Abrams to take out its crew, but no worries, I'll just shoot the wheel. And it doesn't seem like this shell should work that way, so there is a bit of an asterisk in that this might get updated or changed later, because this just seems very bizarre. However, the shell is just in general a very powerful high explosive shell. It can knock out basically anything shooting cupolas and works perfectly fine against light vehicles and anti-airs as well. The Merkavas also have a reload that can go all the way down to 5 seconds on an expert crew, which definitely helps out if you need to swap to that high explosive shell relatively quickly and allows the tank to be fairly aggressive. And to top it all off, the Merkava 4s have the same gears in reverse they do in forward, so a total of 64 kph, and they also don't have a prominent engine deck over the back of the vehicle, so this makes them effectively ambidirectional. You can go reverse or forward as the situation warrants, and this makes them especially good in close quarters or in situations where you simply need to reverse into shots and you're not all that concerned with your armor. The biggest downside, however, and one of the biggest elements that consistently holds the Merkava 4s back, is the lack of anything even resembling reliable armor. That's not to say you'll never bounce shots, because especially the weird angles and the volumetric aspect do tend to throw off some shells, and even DM53 can get absorbed from time to time. However, the armor is not in any way consistent. You can't rely on it or count on it. However, the Merkavas do have this weird strip of armor on the upper hull that does give it a remarkable amount of protection against things like autocannons if they don't know that strip is there, as it will eat shells that have 200mm or less of penetration. When the Merkava 4s were first added to the game, they would have been a comfortable B tier for me. The biggest issue they had at that point was that as a 65-ton tank with a 1500 horsepower engine, they weren't exactly the fastest vehicles around, and the meta at the time was more reliant on mobility, with the only real exception being the T80 BBM that was basically the only vehicle that could consistently absorb hits. On top of that, the Merkava 4s entered the game with the longest reload at top tier. It was slow enough that even the incredibly slow Russian and Chinese tanks would actually out-reload you if you had a level 1 crew. However, both of those factors have shifted in the Merkava 4's favor since it was first introduced. While the Merkava 4 hasn't gotten any more mobile, the top Leopard 2s that a lot of nations use and are currently some of the most meta vehicles in the game have crept up in mass to where they're basically the same weight as the Merkava 4s, plus or minus a few tons. On top of that, the reload got buffed and then buffed again, and now capping out at 5 seconds on an expert crew is the fastest reload you can get at top tier outside of the Type 90. With all of those factors being considered, I will give the Merkava 4s an A grade as a family of tanks. The meta shifting away from blistering speed into more being a somewhat mobile meatball that can absorb of hits has definitely favored the Merkavas, as they are much better in that type of environment, and the fast reload lets them be significantly more aggressive, making them feel less like a mobile bunker and more like a battering ram. On top of that, in my Merkava guides, I recommended to expert the crews if you could afford the silver, and I think it's even more relevant with the improved reload. The Merkavas heavily benefit from an upgraded crew in terms of mobility, protection, and firepower, and in my opinion are some of the best top tier tanks to expert if you have the silver lying around. As a cherry on top, while the Merkava 4M isn't the only vehicle at top tier with a hard kill system, it is in my opinion one of the only good meta vehicles with a hard kill system, because all you really sacrifice from a normal Merkava is half a ton of weight, which you barely even notice, making it on the whole better than vehicles like the BT4A1 or the Black Knight, both of which can kind of struggle either next to their contemporaries or next to the meta. Overall, I found the Merkava 4s to be a very functional and very solid top tier family of vehicles that is very competitive against basically everything it fights, and is only really held back from being S grade by its somewhat lackluster and inconsistent armor. Next up, we're going into the anti-air category, which are obviously important because they're cheap spawns that can allow your teammates to still participate in the match, and this is a very easy F grade, but this is a nice opportunity to talk about what makes a strong top tier anti-air. The highest BR option for Israel is the Chaparral. It lacks a search radar, and when you're dealing with enemies that can launch missiles out to 6 to 8 kilometers, trying to spot them with the Mark 1 eyeball is a bit of a chore and not always possible. The missiles for the Chaparral are infrared only. Infrared can work at top tier if you have a very long lock range, but these don't. Their average lock range against a plane is only about 4 to 6 kilometers, which is really not enough when you consider the range of things like KH-38s and Mavericks. This short range is compounded by the fact that it has a cage seeker, so if you want the missile to lock something, you have to point it directly at it, but this also means you can't lock a target and then fire the missile in front of it, so if the enemy's too close, you actually can't hit it with these missiles because it can't turn fast enough. This is of course especially bad in an environment where you have supersonic jets, so even if they're not at high altitude where you can't touch them, they're likely going to be going so fast that you have to wait till they've already done an attack run on the ground before you can even attempt a shot. The Chaparral is also comfortably one of the worst anti-airs in the entire game for dealing with ground targets. Now, most IR missile systems are not good at dealing with ground targets, however in certain situations you can lock an aircraft and then pull the missile's aim down to try and get it to hit something light like an anti-air, maybe a light tank. However, with the Chaparral, because it doesn't have a cage seeker and the launcher is so high up, even that trick is almost impossible to pull off, and I would guess the number of ground vehicles killed by Chaparrals that were not killed by artillery strikes is basically in the single digits. The vehicle is also not particularly well protected. All of your crew members are just standing out there and can be taken out with normal machine guns. It's also not particularly mobile. It's not amphibious or anything like that. It can't get to objectives particularly fast like something like a Type 93 can. And of course, if you want to use the active scouting feature which the vehicle has, you're going to be somewhat obstructed by this absolutely giant missile tower that the Chaparral has that will poke over most terrain and can easily get high explosive or heat to death. While the Chaparral is technically the highest BR anti-air in the Israeli tech tree, I would actually recommend the Mach Bet over it, because while they're both relatively useless at that battle rating at shooting down planes, the Mach Bet is at least a cheap spawn with a 20mm Gatling cannon that can take out some light vehicles and anti-airs and potentially get you some kills and get back into the match. Whereas the Chaparral is probably just going to be a complete waste of time and you're likely going to die without ever even seeing the aircraft that killed you. Next up is the light tank category, and Israel only has one option anywhere near top tier, and that's the Namur 30. The main advantages of the Namur 30 are good protection, unmanned turret, and a good gun depression for that turret. The main drawback of the Namur 30 is relatively poor mobility. In terms of protection, the Namur 30's protection can feel almost excessive compared to other light tanks, with parts of the hull being able to absorb kinetic shells upwards of 400 to 500mm of penetration, although it's not exactly consistent, and of course parts of the plate can actually be pinned by much weaker shells, and obviously at top tier, the average shell is somewhere between high 500mm and low 600mm, so the protection is less good than it is at the Namur's native battle rating. That being said, the Namur's armor protection is supplemented by a fairly good internal layout that can often make the vehicle difficult to one-shot. The turret housing the spike missiles and the 30mm cannon is completely unmanned and also has a relatively exceptional depression of around 20 degrees, allowing the Namur to use basically any elevated position really efficiently especially compared to a lot of contemporary MBTs that have about half that in terms of gun depression or less. Additionally, the Namur is one of the few vehicles equipped with spikes that doesn't point the spikes up, and in fact points the spikes straight in the same direction as a 30mm cannon, so unlike a lot of its contemporary IFBs, it can just shotgun the spike missiles at close range. Of course, the big crux of the Namur 30 is its mobility. The Namur 30 is noticeably worse in terms of horsepower than the Merkava 4s, and also has about the same mass, making it feel very sluggish by comparison, and it also has a much worse reverse gear than the Merkava 4s. Now, it may seem weird to compare the Namur 30 to the Merkava 4s because the Namur 30 is the light tank and the Merkava 4s are the MBTs. However, I do think this brings up a pretty prescient point in that ultimately the light tank should be able to fill niches that the main battle tanks can't or can't fill as effectively, and with worse mobility than your MBT counterparts, it limits what the Namur 30 can really do in terms of effectively covering down the weaknesses of the MBT lineup. In that respect, I would broadly give the Namur 30 a roughly B grade. In a vacuum, it's a perfectly acceptable top tier light tank. The mobility doesn't completely cripple it even though it's not a strong suit, however its ability to use hold down positions is pretty good, the cannon is effective enough for most targets, the spikes are pretty good if somewhat inconsistent, so the vehicle does generally work, with its biggest weakness being that it doesn't really complement the MBT lineup at all. Next up, we'll be looking at the helicopters, and while Israel does technically have the Saraf and the Patan, I think the AH-60 is the one most players are going to go for, and rightfully so that is the one we will be reviewing. The strength of the AH-60 is that it has a large inventory of fire and forget missiles, and its weakness is that it is rather inflexible. As far as the inventory of missiles, most of the other helicopters with fire and forget missiles can only carry a maximum of 8, whether it be the German Tiger with the PARs, the French Tiger with the spiky Rs, or the Manguska for Italy that also uses spiky Rs. However, the AH-60 can carry up to 16 of them and can still carry 12 of them while carrying a pair of Stingers. And if you just want to take Stingers out, you can take up to 8 of them, although I'm not really sure why you would ever do that. This large inventory of missiles does mean the AH-60 comes off as almost objectively better than the other helicopters I just mentioned, especially if you're just using it as a missile boat, because you can mix and match the amount of missiles and types as needed based on the situation. Just take out a full 16 spikes if you want to go pure ground target, or take out a mix of spikes and Stingers as desired if you want to have a more capable mix loadout. That being said, the AH-60 does have a pretty noticeable lack of versatility. The helicopter is a fairly poor first spawn because while it does have some FFAR rockets, the 20mm cannon is not particularly useful against ground targets and is almost entirely used as a self-defense weapon against other aircraft. On top of that, it is just a somewhat larger and more cumbersome frame to deal with than something like an Apache, so accurately landing rocket pods can be a little bit more of a hassle. Additionally, its only real anti-aircraft response is the Stinger, and the Stinger really struggles against fast-moving planes and only really can hit helicopters if it's basically right on top of them. So as a defense missile, it's not the best, it's not completely unusable, but you would definitely want something more powerful, and if your opponent has a lot of planes up, the AH-60 can definitely have some issues trying to simply stay alive. Overall, I feel like the AH-60 is a pretty comfortable A-grade helicopter. While you will spend some time fighting the inconsistencies of the spiky Rs, this is helped out a lot by simply having a lot more of them, and having more missiles means you can get into different positions and get further away from the helipad without necessarily suffering in terms of efficiency, as you don't have to go back and reload anywhere near as often. On top of that, the 20mm cannon, while it's basically useless against ground targets, does have a good velocity and rate of fire, so if you're dealing with aircraft at very close range that aren't missiling you, it can be a pretty effective weapon in bullfighting. While the Saraf is almost objectively better if you're trying to get a first spawn rocket rush heli, as it both has better agility and also has a much better 30mm cannon for engaging ground targets, I imagine most players are going to gravitate towards the AH-60, and I don't think this is entirely the wrong choice. The AH-60 is a pretty powerful aircraft at this point in the game, and especially if there is no anti-air up, you can absolutely mop up an entire team relatively efficiently, although the spikes do still have that trademark inconsistency. In terms of the fixed wing cast for Israel, the jets, they lack a clear winner, and we'll kind of go through some of the options just to illustrate what I mean. The Kronos 2000 has actually a pretty excellent air-to-ground loadout. It has AGM-65Ds with a thermal seeker. It also has laser-guided bombs and can carry both of those with a targeting pod, and also some Python 3 missiles. So while it lacks Fox 3s, it does have good ordnance. However, the Kronos 2000 does not have access to a thermal targeting pod, it just has a regular thermal targeting pod. If you can overcome this weakness, it is a very capable ground attacker for its battle rating though. The Nets, while it's paradoxically a better airframe, is almost objectively a worse ground attacker, as it has the older B model Mavericks, it still has the Python 3 missiles, and doesn't really add anything else to the equation, so it's almost entirely skippable at this point in the game. The other 4 major contenders are the Barak 2D, the Barak 2C, the Baz, and the Baz Meshpar. Of these aircraft with long-range missiles, the Barak 2D is just objectively the correct choice because it has the best mix of weapon systems out of all of them. It has the Derbies, which are reasonably competent Fox 3 missiles. It also couples them with the ability to carry up to 8 laser-guided bombs, or it can also carry some optically guided bombs, which does kind of make it just objectively better than any of the other 3 that can carry much more limited ordnance than the Barak 2D. That being said, the aircraft still lacks any long-range, fast-moving options such as a Maverick to deal with enemy anti-air, and this does make it a lot more awkward to use in heavily contested airspace. The unfortunate part about the Israeli CAS lineup is that while it does have some good options, it doesn't necessarily combine them all in a single airplane. The AGM-65Ds are on the Kronos 2000, which lacks both Fox 3 missiles and lacks a thermal targeting pod, whereas the Fox 3 missiles are all on aircraft that are limited to laser-guided bombs and optically guided bombs. On the whole, I would say this limitation doesn't make the Israeli aircraft useless, but it does make them a pretty firm B grade for me. They're perfectly functional and can get kills both in the air and on the ground. However, they don't really do anything that elevates them above any of their contemporary airframes and largely just blend in with the crowd. And last and certainly least, we have the tank destroyer category, and this is yet another easy F grade for Israel, but it's also probably a good opportunity to take a moment and explore what makes a truly useful and not useful tank destroyer. The closest TD that Israel has anywhere near top tier is the Giraffe, all the way down at 8.3, and it is not even close to being suitable for a top tier battle rating. The best missiles it has are the ITOs. The ITOs are easily defeated by any anti-kit missile system, whether it be a soft kill or a hard kill. They don't have great flight characteristics, they're not very fast moving, and their penetration is very modest, and it lacks a tandem warhead to deal with things like explosive reactive armor. If you were to run into an enemy like a Russian tank with a Giraffe and basically hit it at any angle with one of these missiles, you're going to struggle to do any damage even from the side. Tank destroyers also ideally work best when they can use concealed positions, and while the Giraffe does technically have a relatively small target that it can present the enemy, just consisting of the gunner and the launcher, part of that target is the completely exposed gunner, which can simply be machine gunned to death. So the fact that the gunner is a relatively small target will come as little solace when they can simply hose them down with bullets and take them out that way. Of course, as soon as the gunner is dead, you will no longer be able to guide the missile, so even if you've already fired it, you might then miss if the enemy were to juke the missile at the last moment. On top of that, the commander's head getting hit by something like a heat round, which would struggle to kill most vehicles at this battle rating, would completely destroy the entire vehicle. The Giraffe also features some fairly underwhelming mobility, so even if there are parts of the map that it might be able to potentially use effectively, the likelihood that it will get there before it's contested by an opponent is basically zero, especially at top tier where most MBTs can cruise between 50 and 60 kbh, and some can even cruise as high as 70. Even at its own battle rating of 8.3, I find the Giraffe is barely functional and not really all that impressive, but if you were to take it all the way up into a 12.0 matchup, it would be basically useless, so it's not even worth devoting to a slot to a vehicle like this. As with the tradition, I'm going to go through some closing thoughts before I give you an overall grade on this lineup as a whole. While I've always kind of liked the Merkava 4s and felt like just being a big beanball that was a bit of a bunker was perfectly fine, the mobility definitely feels a lot more competitive now, and the gun allows you to be significantly more aggressive, and it makes the tanks on the whole just feel very good to play, and this is easily the strongest part of all the Israeli top tier outside of the AH-60, which is another pretty fun vehicle. That being said, those two shining lights in the Israeli tech tree can't really escape a C grade for this overall lineup. The complete lack of any usable anti-air is a problem for all the reasons previously stated, and it is important to note that not having a good anti-air just gives you very few options if you're low on spawn points and the enemy has aircraft up. You basically just have to spawn another ground vehicle and hope for the best, or just leave the match because there's nothing more you can do, and this does limit the Israeli lineups a lot to where you can't really afford to have two bad initial spawns. You kind of need to do something effective and have at least enough spawn points for something like a Namr 30, if not not one of your aircraft. This in turn puts a lot of pressure on you to have good and effective MBT spawns early on in the match, because if you don't have those spawns early on in the match and get some crypt spawn points, you're not really going to have a lot of great avenues to recover later if you have 1 or 2 bad spawns. Combine that with the fact that while the Nommer 30 is a pretty effective vehicle in its own right, it doesn't really do anything to complement the MBTs, and this only further serves to restrict your playstyle and options. While the AH-60 is a very good threat to spawn, it's also a somewhat vulnerable threat, and your options in terms of fixed wing casts are on the whole pretty lackluster. They're reasonably functional, but they're not really going to carry a game on their own either. At this point, the Israeli top tier is basically just Merkava 4Ms and the occasional AH-60 or Nommer, and that's really it. Now, to close out this episode, the top tier review, I've been limiting myself to only reviewing nations where I have top tier ground, air, and helicopters, and currently the 5 nations I've already reviewed are the only nations I have all 3 of those trees unlocked for. I am working on a few other trees such as Germany and also Sweden, but I don't really know when I'm going to complete either of those trees to the point where I'd be comfortable making a review on them. With that in mind, while I might do more of these in the future, this is the end of this series, at least for the time being, although it would be fun to review this basically every year as a nice little annual tradition to see where every nation is at. Of course, all of those are just my thoughts on Israeli top tier. Please let me know in the comments down below if you agree or disagree, if there are any of these vehicles that you love or hate. I always love to read that. If you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel, and as always, don't forget to choose.